Good evening, everybody. We want to welcome you tonight to our final session of Annie's project. I know we've got a few that are online and a couple I've got a few text messages of people trying to get back in. We are excited tonight to welcome Elizabeth Rumley. She is a senior staff attorney at the National Ag Law Center in Fayetteville. At that center, her primary research and scholarship focus is on legal issues in animal agriculture, and she frequently lectures on those issues and others to audiences nationwide. She's co-taught a course covering animals and agriculture production law and policy at the University of Nebraska College of Law and the University of Oklahoma College of Law, and has developed and teaches a graduate and undergraduate course discussing legal issues in animal agriculture at the University of Arkansas. Additionally, she also teaches environmental law at the University of Arkansas and is licensed to practice law in Michigan, Ohio, and Oklahoma after earning her bachelor's from Michigan State University, her JD cum laude from the University of Toledo College of Law, and her LLM in agriculture law from the University of Arkansas School of Law. And those of you guys that have done Annie's project before probably remember Rusty. He always comes and does a fabulous job. And from what I've been told, this is the better half of the Rumley equation. So we were very excited to welcome Elizabeth to help us with Annie's project tonight. She's going to focus mainly on issues in beef and selling freezer beef and some of those new statutes that are coming down the pipe. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
I am happy to be here, and I don't know if I would say the better half, but for those of you who work with your spouses on the farm or off, I feel you. Rusty and I live together, obviously, but we also work together. We're both senior staff attorneys here at the center. And so we focus on different areas of the law, but we do much the same thing for 24 hours a day. Fun stuff. We have 3 kids that he is home with right now. So I'm going to take as long as possible to do this. Please feel free to ask as many questions as you have for me, because I'm out of the house and it's a good day. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Because we have a fairly small audience, I'm going to just open it up and just say, if you have questions as I'm going through, don't bother putting them in the chat box. Just turn off your mute and tell me what they are. And if I plan on covering them later on in the presentation, I'll just tell you that. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and just knock them out right there. It's a little bit easier to do that sometimes with smaller groups than when you have large audiences that sort of feed on each other like that. So I'm going to see if I can figure out how to share my screen. After a year and a half of this, you'd think I'd be able to figure that out. But we'll see if that worked. How did that go for you?
Yes, that's working perfectly.
Okay, that sounds good.
And if anybody has trouble with their unmuting, feel free if you need to send it in the chat, and I can always chime in with that too if you have issues and you can't unmute on your end.
All right, that sounds good. So let me tell you a little bit, for those of you who have not heard of Rusty and myself or at the National Agricultural Law Center. As you heard, we're located up in Fayetteville, and we are the nation's leading source for agricultural and food law research and information. So one thing that is important to know about the work that we do is we don't represent people. So we don't have clients, and most importantly, we cannot give legal advice. So the advice in the discussions tonight is not legal advice, in that I'm not telling you what you should or should not do on your specific operation. Instead, I'm just giving you some guiding principles that you can then take and put into play with a group of people who do represent you. So whether that's working with a CPA, working with a lawyer, or working with whoever that is, you can take this information and put it to use with people who can give you advice specific to your situation. Another thing that we really find that we really take to heart at the center is that our advice is as objective and neutral as possible. We're not an advocacy organization, and we're not a group that is attempting to influence policy in any way. Instead, our goal is just to talk about and explain, this is what the law says as of right now. And people can take that information, and if they would like to use it to develop policy or influence policy in any way, that's their option, but it's not our goal and not what we do. on a day-to-day basis. A lot of the information that we have is available through our website. If you haven't been there, I'd highly recommend that you check it out. We have tons of information, everything from ag leases to animal welfare to environmental law to pretty much anything you can think of when you're looking at agricultural law. With that, I want to turn your attention to what I'm talking about today, which is some legal issues involved when you're thinking about direct marketing, specifically beef, but it's broad enough that if you're talking about really any kind of animal, then we're going to cover a little bit of most animals, at least the major ones. So we're going to start by talking about what kind of laws are in place that sort of govern the framework of slaughtering and labeling and selling the meat from these animals. We're going to talk about who's in charge, what kind of plants these animals are slaughtered in, what are some labeling requirements that you need to be aware of. Then we're going to end the day with some suggestions to limit your risk. As somebody who's interested in direct marketing, obviously you're going to be concerned with how to limit the risk that your operation and your family exposes yourself to. And I want to give you some suggestions for that, as well as some suggestions on some people or types of people that you need to be in touch with. So let's start first, as I said, with what laws we're talking about here. In order to form the framework of slaughtering, labeling, and selling meat across state lines, there were two laws that were passed by Congress: the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Products Inspection Act. As you can imagine, they cover two different types of products. Obviously, the Federal Meat Inspection Act covers more of the large animal side, and the poultry covers more of the small animal side. But the goal of both of those statutes, those laws, are the same. They are to make sure that the products that are slaughtered and sold are safe, wholesome, and correctly labeled. And what they do is these two laws sort of cumulatively, they go about it in slightly different ways, but generally there's a lot of similarities. What they do is they have set standards for inspections at federally inspected establishments. We're talking about sanitation standards, what kind of facility has to be there, what has to happen in the day-to-day operations. They make sure that state inspection programs also meet similar appropriate standards. And then finally, they make sure that products that are coming into the United States can meet these standards as well, right? We want to make sure that everybody has the same playing field in terms of products that are safe, wholesome, and correctly labeled. So products that come in from Canada, from China, from the European Union, all are held to the very similar standards, equivalent to US inspection standards. So what are we talking about when we're talking about standards? Sort of some general requirements are, I think the most important one, or the one that most people think about when they talk about slaughter. One of the major components is that inspectors must be present at all times a slaughter facility is in operation. It doesn't just mean at the beginning of the day and the end of the day. It doesn't mean just everybody stepping in every once in a while. It means continuous inspection. And this is different than many non-meat products, because products that are governed by FDA or the Food and Drug Administration, they don't have a continuous inspection requirement. But USDA products, Federal Meat Inspection Act, Poultry Products Inspection Act do have this continuous inspection requirement. So they have to inspect every animal, continuously staff the processing lines, and they also are responsible for ensuring humane handling in conformance with a couple other laws other than the Poultry Products Inspection Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act. In addition to inspection, you are also required to meet certain sanitation requirements. And this involves a HACCP plan, as well as continuous sampling and testing for microbials such as E. coli and Salmonella. Beyond that as well, there are record keeping requirements, making sure that it is recorded that you are, as the slaughtering facility, in compliance with these practices, and to provide a record for making sure that you're in compliance with your plan as well. And then finally, there is a requirement for enforcement. And the enforcement that USDA can do is up to and including suspending operations of the facility. So if it's bad enough, they can actually shut down a slaughter facility. It doesn't happen very often, obviously. There's many steps before you get to that point, but USDA does have pretty significant enforcement authority. So now let's talk about who is responsible. As I said, the primary responsibility is through USDA and specifically a sub-agency called the Food Safety Inspection Service. People who are employed by the Food Safety Inspection Service by USDA in this capacity, inspectors that go out to meat slaughtering plants, are actually paid by USDA. So they're paid through congressional appropriations. And the only thing that the slaughtering facility has to pay would be user fees for things like holiday inspection and overtime pay as well. Other than that, there's no plans, no charge for inspection services. Now, this is actually a question that we get quite frequently. People are very concerned that if they move to an inspected type of slaughter, then they would also be responsible for paying that inspector to be there all of the time. And that's not accurate. That's not something that needs to be worried about. The only time that the plant facility would have to pay the inspector is in those two very specific situations. And FSIS is responsible for supervision of several thousand facilities across the United States. As of 2021, we're looking at almost 6,500 of them. So that's what we have on the federal level. However, we also have state meat and poultry inspection programs. When states that have these type of programs, they have a mandatory meat and poultry inspection law. They have applied for a cooperative agreement between the state and FSIS, and that agreement is reviewed at least annually. And they have to have inspection requirements that are at least equal to federal requirements. Again, if you have a state inspector in your facility, you're not paying anything other than overtime or holiday pay. The state pays for it. They get some money back from FSIS, but initially the state pays for the inspectors. 27 states have meat and poultry inspection programs. 29, if you count the ones that have passed legislation enabling them in the past legislative session, but 27 have them active at this moment. If you are inspected by a state inspector, then you can only sell within the state that you're processed. So if you're talking about a slaughter facility near Little Rock, that might not be an issue, but near Hot Springs, near Hope, near Fayetteville, all of those where you're near a state border, that can really limit the market that's available to people who are interested in selling piece by piece. In terms of types of plants, we have inspected plants and we have non-inspected plants. And you can do different things with the meat that it goes through a different type of slaughter plant. And that's what I want to talk about now. The most expansive thing you can do, the biggest thing you can do, is if a meat is inspected, a plant is inspected by FSIS. That can be sold in interstate commerce, it can be sold internationally, it can be sold on the internet. Anywhere that it wants to be sold, it can be taken care of that way. In order to have an FSIS inspection, you have to meet their standards. And then if your state has a meat and poultry inspection program, then you have to specifically request federal inspection. If it does not, so think Arkansas right now, before the state program is in place, any plant that's interested in producing products for sale to the public would be inspected by FSIS. Once Arkansas's plan gets into place, once they get the cooperative agreement in place and everything up and running, then If you want federal inspection, you would have to request it specifically.
Hey,
We're
Elizabeth,
talking, yep.
I know I've been asked, and this may be something you're going to cover. Do you have any idea what that timeline looks like of when that we might be state inspected and that may be in play?
I do not. It obviously requires a pretty significant amount of money, and I don't think that they appropriated all of the money that it's going to take. So it's going to, I think, depend on the legislature at that point. So when you're talking about federal inspection, let me just reiterate, it goes back to the FSIS is going to pay these inspectors. The plants are going to be responsible for very minimal overtime and holiday pay as a user fee. The federal inspector will be there all the times the plant is in operation. And when they do that, they will receive an inspection, federal stamp of inspection on the products that are butchered and marked. So that's on the federal side. The states that are in green at the top are the states that have just FSIS inspection as of right now. But within the two within the two laws, the two statutes that allow for the inspection of meat, they also have language in there that says that FSIS can enter into a cooperative agreement with states in order to allow for state inspection. Now we've sort of talked about that around the edges. I want to dig a little bit more into it. In those states, because Arkansas is going to be one of them, in order to enter into this cooperative agreement with FSIS and allow state inspection of meat, the inspection requirements have to be at least equal to federal requirements. They don't have to be the exact same, but they have to be at least equal to. So just by having a state plan or state inspector doesn't mean you can take out all the requirements for HACCP, for example, or all of the requirements for sanitation standards. You still have to meet at least equal to the federal requirements, but it's just a state inspector that's doing it. And again, with state inspection, if you have a state inspector or state inspected products, you can only sell within the state that conducts that inspection, the state where that meat was slaughtered. So if, for example, you go to a slaughter facility in the state of Oklahoma, and that slaughter facility in Oklahoma is inspected by Oklahoma state inspectors because they do have a program, then you're not allowed to sell that meat in Arkansas. You can only sell it within the state where the meat was slaughtered and inspected. So when you're looking at these state programs, the ones in green, the dark green, are states that have state programs. The light green states of Arkansas and Oregon are where there are programs that passed in this most recent legislative session. And the ones that are sort of orangey there are ones where they considered creating a meat and poultry inspection plan, but it didn't pass this session. So it's really something, I think COVID has brought it to a forefront in terms of people discussing this, but this is where it stands right now. So what this means is state inspectors can only inspect meat that can be sold in intrastate commerce, so within the state boundaries. I've hit that point several times because it's really important. In order to be state inspected, you have to meet appropriate facility standards, appropriate food safety standards, and you have to request state inspection in one of the states that's in green. State officials, the state Department of Ag in Arkansas and in many other states would be responsible for it. And inspectors are paid by state funds, and they are later reimbursed half by federal funds. So it does obviously require a pretty significant outlay on the front end. Before it can go into place, the state has to enter into a cooperative agreement with FSIS, creating the program itself. And remember, the standards that the state is going to be meeting are going to be at least equal to these federal standards. That inspector is going to be present at all times, and then you're going to receive a state stamp of inspection. So those are the two major types of inspection. There's a couple other ones that are still important to talk about, but they're not nearly as prevalent. They're not nearly as popular. They're only in very certain situations. One of them is the Federal State Cooperative Inspection Program. These are called the Talmadge-Aiken plants or cross-utilization plants. If you've heard any of those terms, they're all talking about the same process. What happens here in this type of process is it is a federally inspected plant, but it is operating with state personnel. And these products may be sold in interstate commerce. In practice, what this typically means is they're sort of smaller plants that are located in a more remote area. So USDA doesn't have the facility, doesn't have the staffing to send out the inspector to those places. So they contract with the state to do so. But in doing so, those state inspectors apply the federal standards. So they have to request this federal inspection in a state with a program, and FSIS can assign it to a state inspector. As of 2019, there was 412 of these facilities. They're paid with state funds, but they get 100% of the money back. It requires an additional cooperative agreement with FSIS, and it has the same requirements. Inspectors are going to be present all the time. And then the other one is the one I think FSIS is sort of turning more towards and trying to encourage more states to participate in. And this is called the Cooperative Interstate Shipment Program. In this program, if you are a participating facility, you can ship state inspected products in interstate and international commerce. In order to do that, you have to be in a state with a meat and poultry inspection program. You have to have sort of a small plant, 25 or fewer employees, and you have to meet appropriate facility and food safety standards. Okay, so you're still meeting those federal standards. In order to make this work, the state not only has to enter into the meat and poultry inspection cooperative agreement, but they have to enter into an additional agreement that says we want to be part of this cooperative interstate shipment program. The inspectors will meet the same as federal requirements, and the training is overseen on the federal level. If you are a slaughter facility, and this sounds interesting to you, first step is in Arkansas, first step is going to be Arkansas has to get their program put into place so that they have the state meat inspection program. The next step is that they are going to have to apply for a cooperative agreement with FSIS to be part of the Cooperative Interstate Shipment Program. And then the final step is that you, as the slaughtering facility, have to apply to participate in this program. And then once you are approved to participate, the products in your facility can be used across the country or across the world. And this is what it looks like sort of all together. You can see how the different programs are overseen by different folks, different funding sources, none of which is the actual facility that slaughters the animals, different markets, but very similar inspection requirements. Those federal requirements are basically the floor. States can have things that are at least equal to, but if they wanted to go ahead and have even more stringent requirements, they're able to do that as long as they are at least equal to federal requirements. And this is what it looks like if you are interested in direct marketing. You can either arrange yourself as the owner. So let's say that you have 5 steers that you're interested in direct marketing. You can either arrange with the slaughtering processing facility directly and take it there, or you can sell the animal on the hoof and the buyer will arrange with the slaughtering and processing facility. The slaughter and processing facility, it's slaughtered, it's hung, it's processed, and then the owner will pick up the meat. They will pay the processor and they will begin storage. So that owner may be you as the producer, it may be somebody that you have sold the live animal to. Once you have this inspected slaughter, you can do a lot of different things. You can sell directly to the consumer. you can sell to local stores or restaurants, or if it is inspected by FSIS or one of these Talmadge-Aiken or the Cooperative Inspection Service plants, then you can sell across state lines, online, or even internationally. So that's how it will look, how it looks sort of step by step, depending on the kind of slaughter that you use for inspected slaughter.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, so if you're not at all wanting to go across state lines, you're staying right here. There's no reason why I can't deliver my beef to the local person, but only if I'm going to sell it online would I do it any differently than I normally would. Just take them to the butcher and let the other people pick them up, right?
Is it a butcher that is an inspected facility, or is it custom slaughter?
It'd be a custom slaughter.
Okay. So you are selling, and we'll talk about that later, but you are not selling meat. You are selling an animal. So if you, we're talking, example in the previous slide would be more like you are picking up the meat after it's been slaughtered and packaged, and you are selling pieces. Right. Okay.
Okay. Which we have talked about before, but we didn't know.
So that's,
we didn't know if we should.
The things that I've talked about so far, that would be relevant if you do decide I would like to sell, 25 pounds of steak and 10 pounds of hamburger to Joe Smith, who comes to my door, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And if that's what you decide to do, go ahead.
I just was saying, do I mute me back?
Do you what? You can if you want. Yeah.
Okay.
It might be easier to hear everything. All right. So if you do decide to do that, if you have inspected slaughter and you want to sell it by the piece or by the pound, in the state of Arkansas, you do need to have a permit from the health department. It's called a food service permit. They will have to check out your facilities. You need to have there's sanitation requirements, there's temperature requirements, and they will also come and inspect your facility once a year, even though all you're doing is selling this prepackaged raw or frozen meat. So your first step, if this is something you're interested in, would be to contact the Department of Health and see what their requirements are and start working with somebody to make sure that you can meet those requirements before you actually start the process. So we've talked about inspected plants. Inspected plants, again, that's where you can sell the actual meat by the pound after it's already been butchered. The non-inspected plants is the opposite. You are not allowed to sell the meat after it's been butchered. You can sell it before, you can sell it on the hoof, but you can't sell it after. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. So personal slaughter. If you personally are out there butchering the animals, you don't have to have an inspector, as long as you're only butchering them for use within your household. You can see the groups of people who are able to do so. It must be performed by the owner of the livestock or the poultry. But there's no limit on the animals. You can, if you are the producer and you're selling whatever kind of animal, somebody can come and buy it from you, and then they are now the owner and they can slaughter it for their family's use without inspection requirements. However, the animal does have to be healthy and fit for human consumption, and it can't be under unsanitary standards. The important thing here, a very important part, is products may not be sold or donated that have been butchered under personal slaughter requirements, because they were not under inspected slaughter. So they may not be sold or donated. And poultry products do have to have listed on them the owner's name, address, and exempt statement saying this was not processed in an inspected facility. Okay, so this works somewhat, but obviously you're going to run into some problems with people not having the ability or the knowledge to butcher and slaughter their own animals, right? So in order to accommodate people who don't have the equipment, the understanding, the ability to do so, we have this idea of custom slaughter, which is what Diana was talking about with what her family does. So when you have a facility, that slaughters and processes animals for the owner's private use. It's called custom exempt slaughter. And you can do this both for livestock and for poultry. With custom exempt slaughter, the same group of people can use the actual products, the meat products, members of the household, people who are visiting the household, people who are employed by the household. And what happens in this case is the slaughter and processing of the animal is performed by the facility that's acting on behalf of the owner of the animal. So in other words, the facility is providing a service. They are not selling a product. So they are doing something for you. They are doing something that you may not have the ability, the equipment, or even the want to. They are actually slaughtering and processing this animal. There can be more than one owner of a live animal, and products may not be sold or donated. In fact, they actually have to be stamped and marked not for sale, or they must have the owner's name, address, and an exempt statement saying this is not processed, we're under inspected slaughter. So what we're looking at here, if we're talking about custom slaughter, there is not continuous inspection. That's why you can't sell it. You also don't have to comply with the full FSIS sanitation and building regulations. Instead, you have to operate and maintain the facility to prevent insanitary conditions and ensure the product is not adulterated. Basically, you have to keep it clean and up to certain standards to make sure that the meat stays sanitary and healthy. You also have several record keeping requirements. And then finally, you have to label these products as not for sale. So what does this look like sort of in practice? Let me take you to the large animal exception, sort of a large animal example. So you as the producer, you sell the animal or portions of the animal to a consumer while it's still alive. So while it's still out in your pasture, okay? You can sell a quarter of a steer to 4 different people, for example, or half a pig to 2 different people. Once the animal is completely sold, you as the producer act as an agent to arrange for transport to the facility that's going to slaughter it. Each individual consumer who is now the owner of the animal has to make the choice as to how the animal should be processed. How should these steaks be cut? How much hamburger do you want? So forth and so on. What is that cut sheet going to look like? The consumer or the owner is responsible for 2 things: for costs to you for purchasing the animal, and the cost to the custom exempt facility for processing that animal. And that's 2 different checks, 2 separate situations. And at that point in time, once that slaughter and processing takes place, it's done in a custom facility just for that person's private home use. Livestock facilities, processing plants can process some animals that are custom exempt and others that are federally inspected. They can sort of have that split practice. And the way they do that, they have to meet this existing standards for both types of slaughter. Sort of in practice, what it is maybe a plant will have once a month for a week, then they'll have inspected slaughter, and the other 3 weeks out of the month, they'll have custom slaughter. So they have to basically shut down the whole line, clean everything up, make it so it meets the standards for inspected slaughter. They have an inspector there for a week, and then it goes back to the custom slaughter. There's some additional requirements for plants that like to do this, and poultry plants are not allowed to do that. It's just the large animals that are. We also have these mobile slaughter units, which is an idea that sort of ebbs and flows in different places. A lot of interest in remote areas that have very large distances between facilities. These mobile slaughter units can either be custom exempt or inspected, and the same requirements and the standards are going to apply to a mobile unit as would apply to these fixed plants. They can be obviously very expensive to run a mobile unit. It talks about this one mobile unit in this article on Hawaii. They're looking at $500,000 in order to get this mobile unit up and moving. One butcher can normally process 20 to 25 goats or sheep, and 2 butchers can process about 10 cows per day. I thought that was pretty interesting when I was putting this together. There's some additional resources there if you're interested. So what does this look like when you're talking about this uninspected slaughter, the personal versus custom, and what you can do? So we're going to start with the same basic question of Rumley Farm sells an animal to Patsy purchaser. After the sale, Patsy asks to slaughter and process the animal by herself using our facilities and our equipment. In this situation, under FSIS guidelines, this would be personal slaughter because this person is doing it themselves, even though they're using our equipment. Depending on what state you're in, this could be personal or it could be custom exempt. So, and this takes you back to remember how I said the federal guidelines are sort of the floor and states have to set things that are at least equal to federal guidelines, right? So the federal guideline here is personal. So states can set things that are higher requirements. For example, in North Carolina, this would be considered custom slaughter. After the sale, Rusty offers to show Patsy how to slaughter and dress the animal. In this situation, it would be considered custom slaughter because of the producer's assistant and the producer's involvement, and you'd have to meet all of the requirements for a custom slaughter facility. And then finally, after the sale, Patsy asks to slaughter and process the animal by herself using Rumley Farms facilities and equipment. At that point, remember we talked, that's that first example. But it follows with, she asks Rusty to dispose of the resulting waste from the slaughter. This is one of those wonderfully awful lawyer answers of we don't know if this is personal slaughter or if this is custom slaughter. FSIS does not give a definition. It says that if the seller assists in the slaughter, then it's custom slaughter. But there's no definition of whether disposing of the waste would be assisting. So unfortunately, I cannot give more of an explanation of that other than to say even FSIS is unsure of what the answer would be there. And it's never been taken to court. It's never been asked for clarification. On the state level, laws can vary greatly. And so it's really going to depend on what you're doing and the state that you're doing it in to figure out whether that is going to be custom or personal slaughter.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So your example, let me expand on it a little bit. So if I built a website and had people come online and I limited it just to Arkansas buyers online and buy my head of beef, and I sold it, whether it be in a quarter or a half or a 3/4 or a whole one, after I accumulate whatever the orders are, I then haul the beef itself to a third party to be slaughtered, but I've gotten the instructions on how they are to be slaughtered from my website. And I provide that information to the slaughterer that says, this beef, do it this way, this beef, do it that way. And then afterwards, although I'm collecting the money from the purchasers, I pay the slaughterer myself, and then I deliver the beef to the people who bought the beef. Is that considered the custom slaughter still, or?
This is one of those situations where the more
separation
you can get between the two things, the better. Okay. Somebody is okay. Where the more separation you can get between the two things, the better. So under your example, what I would do to make sure that you stay on the right side of custom slaughter is they would contact the slaughter facility directly to give them the cut sheet. You can give them a sample cut sheet and say, this is what some people have done. And then they can just call and say, this is what I'd like to do. They would,
so I would say, here's the slaughterhouse. Here's their cut sheet. Please call them by this time. So they have the instructions on what to have, on how you want your beef cut.
And then they would pay the slaughterhouse directly
For the processing of the
Just for the
beef?
processing, yes. They would pay you for the steer. They would pay the slaughterhouse for the processing.
Gotcha.
And
Gotcha.
then,
You know, the challenge there is the price of that parts of the animal they're not actually purchasing, which is, you know, the head and the hoof and, you know, that part, you know, somewhere that's got to get paid for. I'm probably the one paying for it and then charging them some proportion to pay for the
well,
beef,
I don't think so. I think that the
I'm-
typical thing is that folks will, you know, the processing facility will divide it by 4, take the steer, whatever they charge for the steer, and they divide it by 4.
and charge out to whoever the disposal of the hoof,
Yeah, because
that hoof and that piece of hide.
your
and
your interaction is done, right? You have the animal, you sold it to them, they're the owner, and now you have nothing to do with it.
right. I just have to be able to explain to the owner, you know, what you're buying is meat and a portion of the animal that gets disposed, right? And that's priced into your beef,
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
okay, but the more separation that you can have or that you do have is going to be better when you're looking at whether it's custom or versus a sale, an
Right.
improper
But
sale.
if they are talking to the slaughterhouse directly, we can separate out the beef and they can come pick up their beef directly from the slaughterhouse at that point. So we can box it up and say, this is Patsy's beef and this is Rumley's beef and, you know, this is whoever else's beef it is.
But let me just make sure you realize this is not going to be you doing this. This is going to be the slaughterhouse doing it.
Correct. So you got to find somebody who's willing to do that.
I'm
and you're
pretty sure
paying
that's
them
a
for it.
standard thing with custom slaughter. It is for everybody that I've talked to, at least for ones by family.
Right, in the Fayetteville area. Is that correct?
No, I mean, I'm from Michigan. My husband's from Oklahoma.
Okay.
And both,
So-
I don't know if Arkansas does it very differently, but that's always been my experience, is that that's what the slaughterhouse does, is they'll call, they'll get the cut sheet, and you they take it from there, basically. Like you drop it off and you're done.
Well, Rachel, do you know, I don't know that for my slaughter, the place I get mine slaughtered, but it's because I haven't asked the question, but
I would say most of
maybe
the
I should
folks
just
around
ask the
here,
question. But are the ones,
I would say most of the folks around here that I've worked with especially are pretty used to most of our folks that sell halves or quarters. And so as long as they have either the contact information for who bought your steers or calves, whatever they are, halves, quarters, lots of times if you give them that contact information as, you know, Rumley bought a half, Patsy bought a quarter, and Sheila bought a quarter, here are their phone numbers. If they don't get a call
The other
from
half.
those people by the time they're ready to cut, they can reach out to them. And then when you sold that steer to Rumley, Sheila, and Patsy, you give them that cut sheet with the contact number with, you need to call them by this date and return this form to them. And then once the beef is ready,
right,
they call them and tell them they can come pick it up. And lots of times they'll even split that. You know, if they do a $50 kill fee, which also normally includes disposal or however that particular house does it, they split it between those people, even 50% to the person who bought a half and 25 and 25. Most of our folks are pretty used to that. I haven't heard of anybody around here who's not willing to work with you there.
right. And I just don't get mine slaughtered in Malvern. I get mine slaughtered over here and I just haven't asked. So,
Well, and
Yeah,
I
we
know
get
folks that have
this
used the
mark.
guy in Sheridan, and I'm pretty sure they do the same thing. Because we've
Okay.
actually bought beef that was processed over there at Sheridan. And
okay,
it was pretty easy as a consumer. It was really easy just to email them a copy of my cut sheet, and we got a call when there was a box ready. So
great. That's okay.
And as a producer, that means that your interaction and your responsibility, it ends
When I
at the
deliver,
slaughterhouse
when I
gate, so to speak.
deliver
Yeah,
the beef.
Yep.
I'm out of
you're
it.
done.
Mhm.
Okay.
One more question.
Yep.
When it comes to donations, you said we can't do that.
Mm-mm.
Donations.
Not for
I-
slaughter or not if it's been custom slaughter or personal slaughter.
So in order, like I have a food pantry that I run, I can't give my beef
No.
to,
No, it is. It is a violation of federal law to do that.
Well, I haven't yet. We were planning on it. but-
Yeah.
Okay. What do I have to do? Do I have to go in and make sure it's a FSIS plant?
You just need to
Before I
call
get
them and
started?
ask if it's inspected.
Okay.
And if it's inspected, they'll tell you. You could actually look at the meat and see if it has the inspection logo on it, or if it says not for sale. If it says not for sale, read it as not for sale or donation.
Okay.
And if it says
Diana, where did it
inspected, you
come
do
from?
whatever you want with it.
Do what?
Where did it come from?
Our personal group of beef
Right, but where did you have it processed?
in Bismarck.
They are not federally inspected yet. They are working on it, but they are not there yet.
Right. It can wait. We got to get one good and fat enough anyway. But I was just wondering. I know I can do it through like deer and stuff like that. I'm able to donate, but I can't donate beef. I just
The deer is not a species that is covered under the Federal Meat Inspection Act. And that's why there's different requirements that apply.
And they're getting donated all the time. I mean, we do
Oh,
over here.
yeah. You betcha.
Mhm.
But states have programs in terms of deer is they have it set up where you donate the full deer.
Right.
I mean, you're
That's
not
what we do.
donating it already butchered out. And so that's sort of where they draw the line.
Mhm.
You're not donating it after it's been slaughtered, whether it's
Right.
custom or inspected.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk about labeling. If you have any questions on inspection, well, we can come back to them later. That's fine. I just want to make sure I don't keep everybody here forever unless you really want to be. Okay, so labeling. If it is federally inspected, and so if we're looking at meat that's going across state lines, if it's processed in an FSIS plant or a Talmadge plant, it needs federal approval of your label. Labels cannot be added to products unless they've been approved. So this is another one of those things that's different when you're looking at, say, a can of green beans versus a package of meat. The can of green beans, the people who were, Chef Boyardee, Easy Mac, whatever it is, they can put that label on there without any kind of approval. And FDA will come to them and say, oh, there's a problem later if there is a problem. FSIS looks at it differently and says, no, we're going to make sure that the label is approved on the front end rather than coming back on the back end. So all labels that are on FSIS inspected meat have to be approved by FSIS before they're put on. There's two different categories of labels. There's this generic label, and components of a generic label meat are things like, T-bone steak, 2 pounds, Rumley Farms, things like that, very generic things, things that are going to be very similar from place to place to place. However, if you have a special statement and claim, so for example, if you want to put together a website and have, a logo, for example, that has pictures of a mountain or whatever on it. If you want to say gluten-free, my T-bone steak is gluten-free, or other things like that, then those are called special statements or claims. And in those situations, you actually need to submit a sketch of what the label is going to look like to FSIS and get it approved before you can slap it on your products and sell the products. Okay, I'm going to send Rachel a copy of my presentation. So all of these links will be available to you. But if this is something you're interested in, remember, first of all, it needs to be inspected slaughter. It needs to be inspected by the federal inspector. And you would click on this link right here, and it will take you to the website that you can go to get that approved. On the state level, there are also labeling requirements that are in place by the state of Arkansas. And you cannot have food, cannot be offered in a way that misleads or misinforms the consumer. So for example, you can't package the meat, all the hamburger in red cellophane or red plastic wrap, make it look brighter and make it look redder. And colored overwraps are not permitted. There's some requirements that they have for the label. And if it is selling raw beef or raw meat of any kind, you also have to include a description as listed either here or here. There is more info when you click here. And again, that will be available to you at a later time. Rachel will send it out, I'm sure. And so finally, let's finish up with some suggestions to limit the risk.
Wait, can I interrupt back to that?
Of course.
So if I, back to that website, but I can put on my website that I'm raising grass-fed beef, and that's not labeling the meat. That's just talking about the beef that I'm selling.
Yes, there can be some lines between advertising and labeling, but that would not be considered labeling. You'd still be responsible for following other laws about false advertising. So just make sure that you're following through on the things that you say, but it would not be a labeling issue.
Like, I mean, I can show them out eating grass. I mean, I'm not saying they're 100% grass-fed, but they're still out eating grass all the time.
Right.
You know?
Right, I understand.
So, yeah. We feed them corn, but that's when they're born, feeding them, you know, afterwards we're getting them off onto grass and yeah.
No, I just want to make sure that you realize there are other laws that do interact with this sort of situation based on what you're saying. But when you're talking about labeling, it's not going to be an issue. You just want to make sure, obviously, that you're following through with the things that you say you're doing.
Okay.
I'm sure you are. I have no doubt you are. I just want to make sure, sort of general knowledge, labeling isn't the only law.
Yeah, I understand false advertising. Okay. I'm not going to say anything I don't do.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear that.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, you're good. Okay, let's talk about limiting some risk. In terms of insurance, many farm insurance is absolutely something you should strongly consider. Many just normal homeowners policies, even general farm policies, are not going to cover direct marketing operations. You need a policy or a rider that's specific to what you're doing, and it needs to be tailored to everything that you do. So if you start by saying, I'm going to sell inspected beef from a shop on my facility, people are going to come, I'm going to put a sign at the road, I'm going to, do whatever it is that you do in terms of advertising, and people can buy out of my freezer that I have there. You get a rider for that. If at another time you decide, well, I'm going to expand to do pork, I'm going to expand to do chicken, you want to make sure that you've talked with your insurance agent to make sure that those operations or those activities are also covered, whether it is on the initial rider or if you have to get something else. I don't know what it's like in Southwest Arkansas, but I know in Northwest Arkansas, I know in Oklahoma, I know in Michigan, I know in Ohio, I know in Illinois, I know everywhere that I have ever talked to in the past year and a half, finding a slaughter date can be like winning the lottery. And we're talking in some places up to 18 months in advance, right? So if you end up with, you have 5 calves that you're feeding up and you need to get butchered and you don't have a slaughter date for them, well, you can't really sell them. You can't sell them without that slaughter date, because you sell them to somebody and they can't get them slaughtered. What use is it to them? So demand and slaughter can absolutely be an issue. Demand and storage can absolutely be an issue. So you really need to plan ahead. And I'm not talking a month. I'm not talking 2 months. I'm talking, you need to be looking a year ahead at what you expect to have, what slaughter dates you need to get, and when those animals need to be ready. And to do so, you really need to think, like, how much am I going to be able to sell? What cuts can I sell if I'm looking at inspected slaughter? So if you're doing inspected slaughter, you can, set up a operation that you sell it by the piece. What cuts am I going to want to have in that situation? Am I going to want to have mostly steak, mostly hamburger, some combination, whatever that is. So you're going to want to absolutely be planning ahead, especially in this environment. You need to have a good attorney and a good accountant. There's a lot of different legal components, a lot of different moving pieces to having this kind of an operation, really having any kind of an ag operation, but specifically this, because then you're not only talking about commodity sales, you're also talking about these direct sales and this food service aspect. Business entities can be an important tool. Rachel, I think, is going to be setting up potentially is setting up a business entity discussion at a later date that I've hired Rusty to do. They can provide levels of protection for your personal assets that just selling them as Rumley Farms, Rusty and Elizabeth Rumley would not give you. So business assets such as an LLC or a corporation of some kind. When you find a plant, make sure that you're comfortable with the plant. You have to, first of all, first question is it inspected slaughter? Is it custom slaughter? And because that's going to govern what it is and what you can do with that meat. If you have to sell it on the hoof or if you can sell it in pieces after it's slaughtered. Ask about their compliance history. Do they have compliance issues? Do they have sanitation issues? If you can, find out what, sort of what their lotting policy is. If they keep the products, if they keep the animals separated by lot, it can limit any potential recalls or the scope of any recalls if there is a problem with meat in the future. And along the same lines, your record keeping on the farm is going to be just as important. If you have records of medication dates and withdrawal times and freezer temperatures of the meat itself, inspections by the health department and so forth, all of that will go to show that you acted reasonably, that you are doing everything that you can to make sure that there is no food safety issues moving forward with this meat. That's going to help if it comes to the point that you have to have a defense for somebody getting sick. That's all going to help to bring that defense. And one other thing with the insurance is many insurance policies have a duty to defend clause. And what that means is if you have a claim that's made against the insurance policy, then the insurance company will pay for your attorney because they have a duty to defend you against that claim. And so obviously attorneys aren't cheap. And so having somebody else covering the expenses for that can be something that's very important in a time that can be pretty scary, right? If somebody's bringing a lawsuit against you or a claim against you, it's unsettling. And having somebody else covering the expenses for that attorney can be something that's beneficial and be helpful to you as well. And that's all I had for today. I'm happy to talk or answer any other questions that you had. But again, I'm really happy, really excited that I had the invitation to talk with you today, and I hope it's been helpful. I would suggest that you take a picture of your screen right now, and it has my email address on it. I know questions will come up, later tonight as you're talking about this with your spouse or tomorrow as you're driving to work. And feel free to send me an email, and we can chat about it some more.
Sheila, did you have another question? I think she froze. Well, if nobody else has any questions, Elizabeth, we really appreciate this, and we will stop the recording.